Hello and welcome back to DMCA Chess Academy and to my YouTube channel Chess Melody. This is Chess Coach Ritesh Mathew. Today I'll show you some basics of the opening Queen's Gambit accepted line. So I hope I can cover some basic opening theory related to this opening. So the move order in the Queen's Gambit accepted goes this way. White plays the pawn to d4 to try to take center control. Black also plays the pawn to d5 trying to take some center control himself. And here white is offering a gambit pawn c4. So what's the argument so far? Well, white wants to take center control. Black has also responded with d5 and black also has some center control with that pawn. So what white is arguing is, hey black, can you please move that pawn out of the center? I'm offering you a wing pawn, the c pawn. So please accept the wing pawn and kind of, get out of the way, right? So white is arguing that, hey, I want to have some more center control and I want to dominate the center. So black, please go ahead and accept the pawn. So here, whenever there is a gambit, there are a few ways to deal with the gambit. Either somebody can accept a gambit. In this case, you see the red arrow, which is black pawn takes the white c4 pawn. That would be accepting a gambit, accepting the offer. Or a player can decline the gambit. You see the two green arrows here. The e6 pawn and c6 pawn would be declining the gambit and declining the offer. Hey, sorry, thanks for the offer, but no, I don't want to give up my central pawn. So if black plays e6, that's Queen's Gambit declined. Also, if black plays the pawn to c6, that is also Queen's Gambit declined, but the variation and the opening, if black plays c6, would be called semi-Slav defense. All right. And then a third option could be a counter gambit. So if somebody offers a gambit, instead of accepting or declining it, the other player might offer a counter gambit. So if you see the yellow arrow, the black may play e7 pawn to e5, and that would be called Albin counter gambit. So these are a few ways to deal with any gambit. All right, but for this video, we're going to look at the Queen's Gambit accepted. So black goes ahead and boldly accepts the wing pawn, the c4 pawn. So black accepts the gambit. All right. So here the main variation white can continue is with knight. He can play the knight to f3 square. All right. So white is like, okay, I lost one pawn right now, the c4, but I'm in no rush to capture your c4 pawn, black. Because white wants to prevent black from striking in the center. So black can typically strike in the center in this manner. So white is like, okay, I'll take the pawn, I'm in no rush. Okay, so that's the argument. Now instead of white playing the knight to f3, if white opens up the e3 pawn in a bid to quickly capture the c4 pawn, then let's look at some variations. What happens instead of knight f3, which is this move? Instead of that, if white responds with e3, all right, so white is like, okay, I'm going to capture the pawn in the next move. I'm in a rush, I don't want you to have an extra pawn. All right, here black can counter strike and play e5 pawn. Okay, pawn to e5. So black is immediately striking the e4 central pawn, white e4 central pawn. Okay, now here there are a few ways that white can continue. The two green arrows, bishop captures c4 and knight f3, are better options. But if white captures the pawn, e5 pawn, then that would lead to advantage for black. Or white can continue and push the pawn up to d5, which also has a slight advantage for black. So if the play continues with bishop captures c4, then let's check a few lines. So here black can continue with e captures d, white also can continue with e captures d, and here white may not prefer in the middle game an isolated d pawn. Okay, so to avoid this, he may not go with this line. He may not go with this line, bishop captures c4, in which case black captures ed, and then e takes d, and then that would be an isolated pawn. So it's just a matter of preference, although the position will still be equal. All right, and then what if black plays, let's see, knight to f3 in this particular variation? Then black can play bishop b4 check, right? And then after bishop b4 check, and then white can respond with bishop d2, blocks the check, bishop takes, queen takes the bishop, and black can have equality here. Black manages to have equality in this particular line, right? So then after knight f3, what if e takes d4? Okay, if e takes d4, then white can continue with bishop takes c4, and then here black can again give a check. White can block the check, black takes, white takes, and again this allows equality for black in the knight f3 variation. All right, and then here let's check one more line. Okay, so now let's move on to a little bad option for white. So what if white captures e5 pawn? Well, that opens doors to the d file, and then if you have watched my previous videos, Queen's Gambit accepted traps, then you can watch that video and see how the d file typically becomes open in the Queen's Gambit accepted line. So here, black will capture the white queen, and then white has to capture it with the king because nobody else was protecting the queen, and then black can continue over here, and here black is slightly better in this option. So if d takes e, then it leads to a better position for black. And then the last option that we're going to check here is what if white pushes the pawn forward. Okay, here this allows black to strike the pawn again. All right, now white pawn is attacked twice, one with the c6, one with the queen, but defended only once with the white queen. Again, if white captures, you know what happens. Queen takes queen, and then white loses the right to castle, just as you saw in the previous option. D takes e, then queen captures and white loses the right to castle. So again, after c6, now the white pawn is attacked twice, defended only once with the queen. So this allows white to capture the c4 black pawn, and white will add a second defender over here. Okay, so pawn is attacked twice, defended twice, but then this will allow black to develop another piece and put pressure on this pawn. So now the d5 white pawn is attacked 3 times, pawn, knight, and queen, guarded only twice with the bishop and with the queen. So here white will also develop a knight and add a third defender. So 3 attackers, 3 defenders, everything is balanced for now. But here comes the problem. White can strike with a wing, black can strike with a wing pawn b5 and attack the bishop. Now no matter where the white bishop moves, the b4 pawn is coming, and black will attack the white knight. So if the bishop goes to d3, then it will allow b4, and white is already looking a little shaky over here. Why? Because after the knight moves, the pawn is going to fall, right? Because now this pawn is attacked 3 times, but it's not properly defended. So white is going to lose the pawn. His knight is kind of he had to move the knight from c3 to e4. So this leads to some problems. So after black plays e5, if the pawn pushes up to d5, then these are some variations, and black will have slight edge. So to avoid all this, instead of after black accepts the gambit, and instead of playing the pawn to e3, let's go to the main variation. So Here, instead of playing the pawn to e3, white player will continue with knight to f3. What knight f3 does is it stops the black central pawn strike over here. So that's the whole idea of why white, instead of playing e3, white will play the knight to f3 square. So that's one variation. So the play can continue from here. Knight to black will continue with knight to f6. Now what's the argument by black? Black is like, okay, white, you have a central d4 pawn right now, and you have a knight developed to f3. Now I know you may push the e2 pawn to e4. That's what black is thinking, right? So black is like, no, you know, I want to secure the e4 and control the e4 square, so you cannot have the double pawn center. So that's the argument of black. Now let me back up a little bit. Instead of black playing knight to f6, if black plays the pawn to a6 here, then this is called the Alekhine variation. Okay, so in the Alekhine variation, you know, white can continue with e3, pawn to e3, and black can continue with knight to f6, which will again lead to the main line. But there's just a little variation exists that I wanted to show you. So let's go back to the main line. Black can continue with knight to f6 after white plays knight f3. Okay, so here white can continue with e3 pawn. He can open up the e3 pawn, put a little more defense and solidify the d4, and also open up his bishop, so bishop can capture the c4 extra pawn. All right, so this is one this is the main line continuation. Okay, now instead of white playing the pawn to e3 after knight f6, I want to show you one more variation. Instead of white continuing with e3, white can also continue here with queen to a4. This variation is called the Mannheim variation. Now queen is giving a check to the black king and also attacking the wing pawn, c4 pawn. Okay, so here black has a couple of choices. He can either block the check with his knight, and in blocking, you know, he's adding a couple of attackers on the white central pawn. All right, so here white can continue with defending the central pawn by playing e3, and then black may continue with bishop d7, unpinning the knight, because knight was absolutely pinned to the king. So once black unpins the knight, there could be a discovered attack on the queen. So here white can continue with queen captures the c4 pawn. So this is one sub-variation, Mannheim variation. But after queen to a4 check, instead of blocking it with the knight, here if black continues by playing pawn to c6 and blocking the check this way, then queen can simply capture the pawn, c4 pawn, and then black can develop the light square bishop. White can either play e3, or white can continue with g3 and then fianchettoing his bishop over here to g2. So this is how the Mannheim variation can continue. If after knight f6, if instead of playing pawn to e3, if white continues with queen to a4, that's how the Mannheim variation will continue. All right, but here if white continues with the main line e3, I forgot to show you one more variation. Instead of queen a4, okay, let me go back a little bit. So after knight f6, you know, white can continue with either queen a4, which is the Mannheim variation, or white can also continue with knight to c3. This is called the two knights variation. Here play can continue with black playing pawn to e6, and white can continue with a double pawn center, because white knight is guarding the e4 square. So this is how the play can continue. Now let's go back to the main line. The main line is white will play the pawn to e3. This will solidify the d4 and also open up the bishop's diagonal, so bishop can capture the c4 pawn. Okay, now here the play can continue with black can push the pawn to e6, and here white can continue with bishop captures the pawn. Now here black may strike from the other side. Black wants to strike to our central pawn, so he may strike the center by playing c5. Here white can continue with castling. Okay, so this is the main line. So and instead of castling, white can also play the queen to c2. The idea behind this is called the Furman variation. The idea behind queen c2 is white wants to take control of the e4 square, so he can push the pawn and advance the e pawn to e4. So that's a small idea which is called the Furman variation. So after c5, black strikes the white central pawn. White can continue with castling, and then here black can continue with pawn to a6. All right, so and now instead of pawn to a6, after white castles, if black chooses c captures d4 pawn central pawn, then white can continue with e captures d. Now here white is slightly better because he has castled and he has a good center control. He has two pieces developed, the bishop and the knight, and then his dark square bishop can come out very easily. You can develop it very easily. Okay, but a small downside here is the isolated d pawn. All right, now this brings us to the last variation that we want to check. After the queen's gambit is accepted by black, what about the move e4? Pawn to e4. Can white be a little greedy and play the aggressive e4? Well, let's check some variations of e4. Now, e4 also suffered the same fate as knight f3 and knight and the e3. Same fate because this e5, the aggressive response from black, e5 center pawn strike, was kind of evaluated. What if after e4 black goes with that same line e5? So e4 also was thought of with that same aggressive move by black e5. So let's check how things unfold in e4. The only thing is the much bold and audacious response from black e5. Black can get into some trouble early on if he doesn't castle his king to safety fast enough. Before black can realize the king could be very misplaced very fast. So that's one aspect that black has to remember. After e4, if pawn to e5 center strike, then let's see how things unfold. So here we go. Black does the counter strike on the d4 pawn. Here white can continue with a developing move. All right, instead of capturing or doing anything else, he can play knight to f3, and here if e takes d, then white can again develop the bishop. So this gives white swift and fast development. If black does a counter strike on d4 pawn, then white can bring out two of his pieces, and now again there is double attack on the pawn. So we're going to recapture the pawn back pretty soon. So there are two attackers and one defender. Okay, so here black will continue with knight and bring a second defender to the d4 pawn. Here white can castle. Okay, so white is doing some a lot better things over here by developing the knight, developing the bishop, castling, and not immediately recapturing the pawn. So this gives a little edge to white as of now. And if black mishandles and tries to castle his king to safety by bringing out the bishop or bringing the knight out, those are two inaccurate responses, and black could get into some trouble fast. So the correct response is bishop coming to e6. So let's check both the responses. Well, let's check knight to f6. Well, if knight to f6, then white can continue with queen to b3. Now queen and bishop are creating a reverse battery, and they both are ganging up on the f7 pawn. So here black can continue with knight a5, attacking both the queen and the bishop. Here white can continue with bishop captures. Now bishop is protected by the queen for now. So here the only two logical choices that black has is either king to d7 or king to e7. Well, king to d7 is an instant disaster. Here's why. So let's say they put the king to d7, then it's instant checkmate. Wow. So obviously after bishop captures, king will have to rightfully go to the e7 square. Here white has two choices. Either he can put queen to a3 and give a check. I know the queen is not connected to the bishop any longer, so black can capture the bishop, but we have a counterplay as well. We are creating a fork on the knight. Alright, so here obviously if king takes f7, then queen takes a5. And now if knight captures a4, white can simply continue with the development. And here white has a small edge because white's knight is developed, castling is done, rook is on the completely open file, bishop can spring out in a jiffy, queen is already out, and black's king is misplaced. Black cannot castle any longer. So this definitely gives white some advantage over here, okay? And I want us to check one more variation. If after queen a3, what if the pawn blocks the check? Then here it seems like black king can capture our bishop for free, but here we can save the bishop with the knight. And if black tries to use the tactic destroying the defender and asking the knight to leave the bishop so black can capture the bishop from here, if that's what black does, h6, trying to drive the knight away, then we can queen can capture the c5 pawn and give a check. Here black has two logical choices. If king d7, then it's going to be a little problem, but queen d6 is much better move. So let's check both. Here if queen d6, then we can get our material back, we can get an extra knight, and then if black captures our knight, then our bishop can be saved. So that's one choice. And then what if king goes to d7? If king d7, then we can capture the pawn and give another check. Here black has four logical looking choices. There are actually five, but we're just going to look at king e7, bishop blocks the check, king goes to c6, or king goes to c7. I'm not going to check knight blocking the check for obvious reasons, you know. So here let's check what if king goes to e7. Well, if king e7, then queen can again give a check. Here there are only two logical choices for black. Either he can block it with the bishop, in which case it's an instant disaster, checkmate. And if bishop doesn't block and if king goes to d7, then here white can continue with rook to d1 and skewer the king and the queen. So once the king moves out of check, the queen is gone. Alright, so that's what happens if king goes to e7. But let's check some other choices. What if king goes to c6 here? If king goes to c6, then black will just lose the queen. So that's a completely losing move again. And let's check what happens is if bishop blocks the d6. So if bishop blocks the check, then here you can fork, the pawn can fork the bishop and knight, and you can already see the dangerous effects for black. Black is pretty in a pretty serious trouble here. And then if the correct if black moves the correct variation, which is king to c7, here again queen can give a check. And then if bishop or queen blocks, which are the yellow arrows, then our queen can just capture the a5 knight, and we can get our material back. But if king goes to b6 square, black king goes to b6 square, then the knight is coming to white knight will be developed to the c3 square, and pretty soon you can see black is completely in big trouble. So these are some variations I wanted to check after c5, if c5 blocks the check. So that's one choice. After king goes to e7, queen a3 is one choice. But then the second choice that white has is queen to a4 is also possible. And queen again has disconnected with the bishop. Queen is no longer guarding our bishop. So if king captures, then Again, queen captures the knight, white got the material back, and if knight captures, then it leads to pretty much the same line. White has a small edge over here. So this is what happens if after we castle, if knight comes to f6. Let's check what happens is if black brings the bishop out in the hopes of castling. Well, if black brings the bishop out to c5 in the hopes of supporting the pawn a third time, here the f7 trick is still possible. A knight and bishop both can gang up on the f7 pawn, and the threat is knight captures f7 pawn and does a fork on the queen and the rook. So this will lead to this kind of tactics. And then if black adds a second defender to the f7 pawn, then white can capture the pawn and sacrifice the bishop for the price of a pawn. And if black captures the bishop, white captures the knight, black recaptures. So it seems like white lost a bishop and knight for the price of pawn and a knight. So it looks like black lost material, but in fact he didn't, because here we have queen h5 check, and now we are attacking the bishop, forking the bishop and the king both, and once the king moves out of check, we can white can get the material back. So after castling, as you see, both these lead to a little problem for black, and in both, black loses the right to castle, and white has a swift development over here. So that brings us to the correct option, bishop e6. Black will have to play bishop e6, and then we can capture the bishop and black can recapture it back, and this leads to an equal position. So these are some lines with the e4. So white can also try playing e4, the aggressive e4, and take the double pawn center and gain some more center control. And if black strikes with e5, then here are some variations. So folks, this is all for the Queen's Gambit accepted. These are some basics that I covered. So if you are playing white and you face the Queen's Gambit accepted, then you may continue with e3 or e4 lines. And if you're playing black, then you might want to add this in your opening repertoire. The Queen's Gambit accepted. You can accept the gambit, and here are some options for you as black. Alright, so I hope you like this video. Do like and subscribe to my channel Chess Melody for more music and chess related videos. So do add this in your repertoire, Queen's Gambit accepted, and I hope you like the video. Thank you and have a great day.